system is composed of three main components: the heart, the blood vessels, and the blood. In this PowerPoint, we're going to spend our time working on the heart and blood vessels. So let's go ahead and get started. And as always, we want to begin with some introductory information or some overview. Let's take a look at the structure of the cardiovascular system. Of course, we know that cardio, or at least I would think everybody knows, that cardio refers to the heart. Vascular, on the other hand, refers to the blood vessels. Literally, for medical terminology, vascular means a system of tubes. If we take a look and break down the word, AR is the suffix ending AR. Many of you may know means pertaining to. Vasc means tube. So literally, vascular means system of tubes. The cardiovascular system is considered to be a closed system in humans. That means blood's never found outside the tubes, outside the blood vessels, that is. And you may say, well, that makes sense, but there are organisms that have what we call an open circulatory system, where the blood is found outside the blood vessels for a period of time. For example, we may take a look at lobsters or crayfish. They have an open circulatory system. The lobster has a dorsally located heart, and that heart pumps blood into a major blood vessel that then distributes the blood over top the tissues. The blood leaves the vessel for a period of time, drains over the tissues, bathes the tissues, and is recovered into a ventrally located blood vessel, which then returns the blood to the heart. Because the blood is outside the tubes for a period of time, that circulatory system is referred to as an open circulatory system. But under normal circumstances, humans have a closed circulatory system. Blood's never found outside the vessels. Okay, so what are the components of the cardiovascular system? Well, obviously, cardio refers to heart. The heart is the component that is the muscular pump that pumps the blood through the blood vessels. Of course, the blood vessels actually transport the blood out to the various tissues of the body. And whenever we take a look at blood vessels, we're going to consider three different types of blood vessels. We're going to consider arteries, and we say that arteries are efferent blood vessels. That means that they carry blood away from the heart. And that's a good way to think of them. You know, maybe whenever you were in high school or a health class, something like that, arteries were discussed as being blood vessels that carry oxygenated blood. Not a good way to think of it for us here in anatomy and physiology, because there are going to be veins that carry oxygenated blood. So I'd rather us think about the arteries as being efferent blood vessels that carry the blood away from the heart. In other words, they allow the blood to exit the heart. And that's a good term to associate with efferent to help you remember it. Exit. Anytime you hear the word efferent, you're thinking something is going to exit an organ or a tissue. Okay, in addition to the arteries, we also have the veins, and veins are considered to be afferent blood vessels. So afferent blood vessels allow blood to access the heart. So the veins are going to carry blood back to the heart and allow it to have access or entry into the heart. So a good term to think of when we hear the term afferent is access. And finally, we have the capillaries. And the capillaries are the place where the exchange of nutrients, respiratory gases, waste products, so on and so forth is going to take place. So the term I put up there, exchange, I think is an appropriate term to use for the capillaries. And of course, the final component of the cardiovascular system is the blood. It's actually the blood that transports the carbon dioxide, the oxygen, the respiratory gases, that is, and other components such as metabolic waste products, and we could even add nutrients to that. Okay, let's take a look at some FYI stuff for your information. You know, every time I talk about the cardiovascular system, I get a lot of questions from students, and I've put up some information here that centers on many of the questions that you get. First question I get a lot of times is, how big is your heart? The answer to that question is your heart is about the size of your clenched fist. So if you take your fist and close it, something like this, that's about the size of your heart. Now, you might look at that and say, well, don't some of us have bigger fists and some small? Yeah, well, that's true. But then again, some of us are a little bit bigger and some of us a little bit smaller. So about the size of our clenched fist. The next question I get a lot of times is, how much blood does the heart pump? Well, the adult heart pumps on average about 4,000 gallons of blood each day. And you say, Mr. Trivis, how do we come up with 4,000 gallons of blood? Well, on average, the heart pumps out about 70 milliliters of blood with each beat. And we'll be addressing that issue a little bit later in this PowerPoint. If we take 70 milliliters of blood per beat, and we take 60 to 80 beats per minute, and maybe take the middle of that around 70 beats per minute, and multiply that times 60 minutes, and multiply that that gives us an hour, and multiply that times the number of hours in a day, we come up with somewhere around 4,000 gallons of blood each day. Next up, the question is, how many times does your heart beat? Here's an interesting statistic. Your heart beats about 30 million times a year. Isn't that amazing? Your heart's an amazing machine. 30 million times a year. And again, we get that how many beats per minute, multiply that times how many minutes in an hour, how many hours in a day, how many days in a year, and you come up with roughly about 30 million times a year. And the next question is, how many blood vessels do you actually have in your body? And the answer to that is the adult body contains somewhere around 60,000 miles of blood vessels. That's enough blood vessels, by the way, if you took them out of your body and laid them end to end, that'd go around the equator of the Earth about 2.5 times. So it's an amazing amount. And here's a kind of a side statistic that goes with that. For each additional pound of fat that we have in our body, it takes 5 miles of blood vessels to support that fat. And the next question I get is heartbeat. When you hear the sound of the heart beating, that lub-dub, 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 what is it that's making that sound? Is it the heart muscle itself contracting? Well, actually, the heart beats the sound of the valves in the heart closing as blood is being pushed through the 4 chambers of the heart. So we actually are hearing the sounds of the valves snapping shut as blood passes through the heart. All right, moving on from introduction to overview, let's take a look at the reason why we have a cardiovascular system. There's several functions of the cardiovascular system. Obviously, one function is to transport various substances from one part of the body to another. The respiratory gases, oxygen, carbon dioxide, the metabolic waste products, and nutrients that we talked about previously. But in addition, the cardiovascular system also aids in the defense against disease-causing microbes. In the blood, whenever we talk about it, we'll take a look at white blood cells. And these white blood cells have the ability to provide that defense against disease-causing microbes. So that's a function of the white blood cells in the blood. The blood also, or the cardiovascular system, helps to assist in the repair of damaged tissues. This, again, is another function of the white blood cells, and we'll be talking about that whenever we get into the blood. The cardiovascular system also plays a role in acid-base balance or pH balance. So in order to function properly, cells need the pH to be maintained somewhere around 7.3 to 7.4, 7.35 we might say. That's one of the functions of the cardiovascular system that we're going to be taking a look at. And one big component of that is in the red blood cells, we see hemoglobin. Hemoglobin has the ability to help stabilize the pH of the blood. So we'll be taking a look at that as well. And then finally, the cardiovascular system also plays a role in the regulation of body temperature. Blood is about 90% water. One of the properties of water is it has a high heat capacity, which means it has the ability to absorb and release large amounts of heat without becoming significantly warmer or cooler itself. So that's very important in helping to maintain our body temperature at that critical 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. All right, with that said, now let's take a look at the anatomy of the system. We're going to begin our look at the anatomy of the cardiovascular system by discussing the arteries. Okay, remember, arteries are, what do we say? They are efferent. They transport blood away from the heart, so they allow the blood to exit the heart. Structurally, the arteries are tubes, and these tubes consist of walls that have 3 layers in them. Each of the layers in the walls are referred to as tunics. The innermost layer of the wall is referred to as the tunica intima. This is also known as the endothelium based upon the type of tissue that makes it up. The middle wall, the middle layer, is referred to as the tunica media. The tunica media is comprised of elastic tissue and some smooth muscle tissue. And then finally, the outermost layer of the artery wall is referred to as the tunica externa, or another name for tunica externa is the tunica adventitia. This tunica externa is composed of loose connective tissue. Can you think of a loose connective tissue that you studied in AP1? Areolar connective tissue. So there's a good example of what we're talking about here when we take a look at the tunica externa. So the 3 walls, the tunica intima, the tunica media, the tunica externa. Here's a diagram on this slide that depicts the structure of the walls. And I think this is important. This might be a little different than what's in your textbook, but I think it's important to look at alternative diagrams and pictures so we really get an idea of how things are really composed and put together and not just kind of memorize a single picture. So whenever we take a look at this, we can see the endothelium there. And remember, the endothelium, another name for endothelium, is the tunica intima. So the tunica intima actually consists of 3 components. The endothelium, which you can see, is made up of a single layer of scale-like cells, simple squamous epithelium. And those cells adhere to a kind of a sticky layer, which is referred to as the basement membrane. Now, some of you may have learned the basement membrane as the basal lamina, which is actually the more appropriate name for it. But that's the sticky protein layer that the epithelial, the simple squamous epithelial cells adhere to. In addition to the basement membrane, though, there is also a very thin elastic layer that makes up the final component of the tunica intima. This is oftentimes referred to as the internal elastic layer. Moving from the tunica intima, we go to the tunica media. And the tunica media is made up of smooth muscle tissue and once again another layer of elastic tissue. This layer of elastic tissue is a little thicker and is oftentimes referred to as the external elastic layer or lamina. So the smooth muscle tissue helps to give support to the wall and is much thicker there. Okay, and then finally, there's the connective tissue that makes up the outer wall of the artery, which is the tunica externa or the tunica adventitia, as we mentioned. So you can see all those components in this diagram. Okay, next up, when we talk about arteries, basically what happens is as major arteries exit the heart, they give off branches, and every time branches are given off, the arteries get smaller and smaller and smaller until we branch down to the smallest arteries that there are in the body, and these small arteries are referred to as arterioles. Arterioles are so small that they're just barely visible to the naked eye. And again, if we look at this from a medical terminology perspective, O-L-E-S, oles, whenever you see that, that's a diminutive ending. Diminutive endings mean small versions of something. So an arteriole is a small version of an artery. It has the exact same structure of the artery, but it's very small, just visible to the naked eye. Okay. An MVP here, as far as arterioles are concerned, is that the tunica media is mostly smooth muscle tissue. And that smooth muscle tissue contracts and relaxes to constrict and dilate the arteriole. This is going to help regulate blood pressure and help to shunt blood. Now, if you're not familiar with blood shunting, what that means is that we have about 5 to 6 liters of blood that are constantly circulated through our body. Of that 5 to 6 liters of blood, it's not enough blood to provide all the tissues with the amount of blood that they need to provide support whenever they're working at their maximum. So decisions have to be made. Which tissues are going to get the highest volume of blood? And that's called blood shunting. And so arterioles, let's say, for example, that I decide I want to go for a run. And so the muscles are going to have a high demand for oxygen and nutrients. So what will happen is arterioles, the smooth muscle in the tunica media of the arterioles leading into the muscles, will dilate or open up to allow a greater volume of blood to flow into the muscles. But if we're going to allow a greater volume of blood to flow into the muscles, then we're going to have to take blood away from somewhere else. So maybe in the digestive system, arterioles carrying blood into the digestive system will constrict, or their diameter will get smaller in size. This reduces the amount of blood flow into the digestive system or digestive organs. So that means the muscles get more blood, the digestive system gets less blood. We're shunting the blood over to the muscles and away from the digestive system. So that's blood shunting, and the tunica media of the arterioles is important to control blood shunting. All right, next up, let's take a look at the capillaries. Remember, capillaries are places where substances are exchanged between the blood and body tissues. I have a little asterisk there, and that's because the exchange that takes place is not actually between the blood and the body tissues directly, or the cells of the tissues, but the exchange takes place between the blood and what we call interstitial fluid. So remember that we're made up of about 60 trillion cells, and each one of those cells is separated from another cell by resting in what I like to refer to as its own puddle of water, or the interstitial fluid. So when substances are exchanged between the blood and the body tissues, the exchange actually takes place from the blood into the interstitial fluid, and then from the interstitial fluid into the body tissues. Capillaries are microscopic, too small to be seen with the naked eye. We need a microscope to be able to see them. And capillaries consist, the walls of the capillaries consist of only one tunic, and that's the tunica intima. So capillaries essentially contain endothelium, and that's it. That endothelium, again, is made up of, as we saw in the previous diagram, simple squamous epithelium. And that lines the inside of the wall of the capillary. And there you have the asterisk. The exchange, remember, actually occurs between the blood and the interstitial fluid. Okay, so one of the things we need to take a look at here when we're studying capillaries is the capillary beds. Capillary beds are networks of capillaries. So what happens when an arteriole enters the tissue? The arteriole will give off branches of many capillaries from a single arteriole. And when you have these many branches from a single arteriole, these are what we refer to as the capillary beds. These capillary beds are going to be present in all regions of the body, and an important structure associated with the capillary beds that controls the entrance of blood into the beds are what we call precapillary sphincters. So once again, precapillary sphincters will control the blood flow into or through the capillary bed. In other words, we say that the precapillary sphincters control blood perfusion. We think of the perfusion of blood into the tissues. Precapillary sphincters are going to control the blood flow into the capillary bed and therefore into the cells of the tissues themselves. All right, so the term we used with capillaries, we said was a good term, is exchange, because that's where the exchange of the respiratory gases and nutrients takes place. But what controls capillary exchange? Well, capillary exchange is primarily the result of two I'm drawing a blank on this, of two components, let's just say for now, and that is osmotic pressure and blood pressure. So capillary exchange is controlled, we say, by osmotic pressure and blood pressure. How? Well, let's take a look at blood pressure first. Blood pressure causes fluids to move from the capillaries into the tissue fluids. Osmotic pressure, on the other hand, causes water to move from tissue fluids back into the capillaries. So we're going to take a look at how this works. So again, capillary exchange, we would say, is primarily the result of osmotic pressure, blood pressure, and we can actually add diffusion to that as well. When we take a look at blood pressure, one of the things to consider is that at the arterial end of the capillary bed, the blood pressure is going to be higher. The closer you are to the heart, the higher the blood pressure is. The further away from the heart you get, the lower the blood pressure is. So the arterial side of the capillary bed, the blood pressure is always going to be higher than it is going to be on the opposite end, or the venous end of the capillary bed, where the capillaries come back together to form the venule. As a result, at the arterial end where the blood pressure is higher, that blood pressure causes water to move from the capillaries into the tissue fluid, causes kind of the water to squirt out. At the venous end, again, the blood pressure is lower, and so at the venous end, blood pressure is not going to cause water to squirt out, so to say, of the blood vessel. Now, osmotic pressure, on the other hand, at the venous end is going to be higher than the blood pressure. This is going to cause water to move from the tissue fluid into the capillaries. So if you can imagine, as you cross the capillary bed, the blood pressure is going to get lower and lower, and the osmotic pressure is going to get higher and higher. Eventually, once you pass about the midpoint of the capillary bed, the osmotic pressure is going to be higher than the blood pressure, and that's going to cause water to be recovered from the tissue fluid back into the capillaries. Now, not all the water is going to be recovered into the capillaries, so we have to get the excess water out of the from the tissues, from the interstitial fluid. We have to drain off the excess water, and that excess water will enter lymphatic capillaries, which we'll discuss whenever we get into the lymphatic system, and that will help keep swelling down, for example, whenever there's injury to a blood vessel or some other kind of insult. Okay, so there it is again. It's primarily the result of osmotic pressure, blood pressure, and diffusion. So what role does diffusion have to play in capillary exchange? Well, as I mentioned, as you move across the capillary bed, the blood pressure is going to be dropping, and the osmotic pressure is going to be rising. At the midpoint along the capillary bed, what's eventually going to happen is the blood pressure and the osmotic pressure are going to cancel each other out. And once that happens, that's going to allow oxygen, carbon dioxide, and other nutrients to diffuse out of the capillary beds and into the interstitial fluid. There's nothing to impede their flow. Uh, so oxygen and nutrients, excuse me, are going to diffuse out of the capillary beds, and carbon dioxide and waste products are going to be able to diffuse into the capillary beds. Oxygen and nutrients out because they're moving from where they're in high concentration in the blood to where they're in low concentration to the interstitial fluid and eventually into the cells. And carbon dioxide, which is produced by the cells, and waste products produced by the cells, are going to be at high concentration in the cells. So it's going to move from the cells into the interstitial fluid and eventually into the blood. So here's a diagram then that represents everything that's kind of going on there. So on the left-hand side here of the capillary bed, we can see the arteriole there in red, and we can see the vein or venule in kind of blue or purple on the opposite end here. So blood's going to flow through the capillary bed from the arterial side to the venous side. Blood pressure is going to be higher here on the arterial side and lower here on the venous side. So on the arterial side, because of the blood pressure, high blood pressure, water is going to squirt out. As we move across the capillary bed, blood pressure is going to drop, osmotic pressure is going to increase, and water is going to be recovered. So as you take a look at the arrows there, you can see the white arrow for water is moving out of the capillary bed on the arterial side and into the capillary bed on the venous side. Okay. Now, also, by the way, take a look at the arrows, and you can see the key here. And the key shows how the blood pressure is changing as you move across the capillary bed. So the longer arrow on the arterial side means the blood pressure is higher. The shorter arrow on the venous side means the blood pressure is lower. The green arrows inside the capillary wall, notice on the arterial side they're short, meaning the osmotic pressure is lower, and on the arterial or the venous side, excuse me, they're longer, meaning that the osmotic pressure is higher. And so these changes in osmotic and blood pressure are what account for the water being released from the capillary bed on the arterial side and recovered into the capillary bed on the venous side. Now, as we move into the center of the capillary bed, we can see where diffusion is going to take place. Oxygen is going to diffuse out of the capillary bed. Carbon dioxide is going to diffuse in. And nutrients like amino acids and glucose are going to diffuse out of the capillary beds and into the interstitial fluid and eventually into the cells, while waste products are going to be recovered from the cells. And again, how are these happening? This is happening by simple diffusion. And we'll finish up this part of our screencast by just simply taking a look at this diagram, which shows the capillary bed. We can see the arterial side here and the venous side here. And we can take a look at the capillary bed then. And what's important that we see here is the green lymphatic vessels and how they are kind of meshed in with the capillary bed. Those lymphatic vessels are going to be very important because the lymphatic capillaries are going to recover the excess water from the tissues that isn't recovered into the capillary bed itself.